All right. Okay. Hi, everyone. Um, Happy to see everyone here. Welcome to Scholarium's monthly lecture. This is our third lecture in 2021. It's a very eventful year. We're all very excited to see everyone attending today. I'm Yair Lior. I'm faculty at Religious Studies at Boston University and one of the founders of Scholarium. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I just want to say a few words about Scholarium. Not too much. We do a lot of things, but there's kind of in a nutshell, Scholarium is a nonprofit initiative that brings expert learning, scholarship, and teaching beyond the confines of the traditional university setting. So at Scholarium, we're especially excited about promoting ideas across academia and the public sphere, and to touch upon real world problems, concrete problems, in that sense, to make scholarship a little bit more pragmatic, so to speak. Um, we're also very much interested in reaching out beyond traditional academic departmental borders in order to engage in exciting multidisciplinary research. We are true believers in cross-disciplinary work and the notion that answers usually can't be found in one specialization or in one department. It really requires um, collaboration between not only between scholars but also between scholars and experts in the public sphere. Let me move on to the introduction. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for today, who's also a colleague and a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Kate Stockley, who received her PhD in religion and science from Boston University. She is a researcher at the Center for Mind and Culture at Kenmore Square, Boston, also known as CMAC, which is another very exciting nonprofit organization that is engaged similarly in interdisciplinary work, modeling religion, very exciting projects over there, definitely worth checking out. In addition to studying topics that are related to technology and spirituality, Dr. Stockley also analyzes the pervasive gender sex differences in religion and spirituality from a biopsychosocial perspective, or in simple English, from multiple dimensions, which include the biological dimension, the psychological cognitive dimension, also the sociocultural dimension. Fascinating stuff. She won't talk about that today. What she will discuss today is the emergent field of technological innovation in the context of religion and spirituality. Her lecture will be based on a new book that she co-authored with Professor Wesley Wildman. You have the link to that book, the last link that I pasted there. The book is called Spirit Tech, The Brave New World of Consciousness Hacking and Enlightenment Engineering. So with no further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. Kate Stockley. I'll just say that this will take more or less 40 minutes, correct, Kate?
Right. Yeah.
More or less 40 minutes, and we'll follow up by Q&A for as long as it takes. It can be 20 minutes, it can be half an hour. If you have some interesting questions, feel free to paste them, to send them in the chat box as we go on, and I'll start reading them out. But preferably, if you have questions at the end, we'd like you to ask those questions and to have, as usual, an engaging conversation that will follow up. So there you go, Kate. The stage, the screen is all yours.
Excellent. All right. Do you see my screen then shared?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Well, good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. I have a few friends in Alaska who have logged on too. So it's only 3 p.m. here. But to everyone, thank you so much for coming today. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my research with you. This has been sort of a really exciting project, and so I always really enjoy when I have a chance to kind of get people's feedback and thoughts on the project and on the material itself. So today I'm going to talk to you about this emerging field of technological innovation that's focused on spiritual growth and well-being. So the folks that we're talking about today are harnessing state-of-the-art brain science to not only increase our understanding of spiritual and religious experiences, including deep meditative states and mystical experiences like ego dissolution and the sensation or sort of the knowledge of oneness and unity with all, but also to actually help bring about these types of experiences. So they see that such experiences can be powerfully transformative in people's lives, but are also somewhat mysterious and kind of elusive, kind of difficult to achieve sometimes requiring years of focused practice and expert guidance and sacrifice throughout life, especially in the case of really deep meditative states. So the folks I'm talking about today are asking the question, look, if we can see what these experiences look like in the brain using brain imaging equipment, by sensing brain waves, things like that, then maybe we can actually stimulate the brain or guide the brain into these states and help more people benefit from them, right? Maybe we can actually democratize this process and help more people reap the potentially life-altering benefits of spiritual experience. So that's sort of what these folks are interested in doing. So the research that I'm presenting culminated in the publication of my book, which was co-authored with Wesley Wildman, who's here with us today also, called Spirit Tech, The Brave New World of Consciousness Hacking and Enlightenment Engineering. And seeing this emerging tech space, Wesley and I saw something of interest for religious studies scholars like us. We saw how different types of folks are using this science and technology to reimagine their spiritual lives in new ways, ways that we hadn't really considered before, right? These new applications of technology are not just little fringe oddities. Perhaps they were, fairly fringe a few years ago, but at this point, they're really making their way into the mainstream. And so it's worth scholars' attention, right? And it may be tempting at times for scholars and for people, anybody, to kind of eschew this group as sort of, maybe overly opportunistically entrepreneurial. After all, many of them are quite entrepreneurial, and savvy marketers and invested in product scalability, these kinds of things. Or perhaps these technologies are a little too steeped in this kind of shallow merger between Silicon Valley peak performance and on one hand, and on new age woo on the other hand. But I'm going to suggest that we think a little more carefully about these dismissive assumptions that we're carrying with us. Sure, obviously, no doubt, there are always going to be charlatans. There are always going to be snake oil salesmen wherever you look, in almost any industry, and certainly when it comes to religious movements and spiritual movements. But Wesley and my research reveals a more interesting profile, I think, of these spirit tech innovators and users. Most of the folks involved in the research and development of these new technologies actually embody this work as kind of a vocational calling. Some see it as a calling to serve those who are suffering or lost, offering a space and opportunity for healing and for community that otherwise wouldn't be available to these people. And others view their engineering innovations as dedicated to the spiritual growth of our species. In fact, the innovators that we spoke with recognize themselves as actively working against the current modes of technology. They see that our relationship with certain technologies has become very toxic, right? Our tech serves the goals of efficiency, productivity, and profit, not their spiritual technologies, but the technology that we know these days. And this tech often reflects greed and exploitation and abuse. But these innovators are kind of suggesting that technology could actually reflect other, more life-giving goals. So the leading advocates within the spirit tech community intend not only to heal and sort of counterbalance the negative effects of technology, but also to, in some instances, accelerate the awakening of individuals and to actually, in some instances, launch humanity into the next phase of its evolution. This is sort of, so there's everything from kind of more humble, small goals to these kind of grand goals that these folks are thinking about. So either way, really interesting from a religious studies perspective. And this is obviously the very opposite of using spirit tech merely to induce a spiritual high, right? It's a vision of a new type of human culture, a new relationship with technological development, a new understanding of our brains and bodies. They're looking for something more humane, more connected, and more peaceful. So I think that the trick for these folks, of course, is how to maintain these goals and values while also developing complex technologies in the real world. And this process, of course, as we know, takes time, money, research, science, company development, advertising, safety testing, selling, all sorts of practical concerns that have to be kept in mind. And there are tons of also fascinating philosophical and ethical questions that accompany these efforts, and the spirit of the spirit tech visionaries. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about a few of what I see as the most kind of interesting and potentially promising technological applications. And I'll talk about how they got started and the science behind them, just to kind of give you an idea of what are we even really talking about, when I say spirit tech. So throughout this discussion, I'll kind of reflect on the field as a whole from a religious studies perspective. For example, from a sociology of religion point of view, these technologies may be reflective of a contemporary shift in the religious landscape that we're seeing, since many spirit tech innovators are end users are kind of within the spiritual but not religious crowd. And they may give some insight into how people are renegotiating their spiritual identities in our current social secularizing milieu. So then I'll consider some of the most pressing questions that people tend to bring to the topic. For example, are the experiences that technologies enhance authentic religious experiences, or are they just kind of a cheap imitation, right? And also, are these technologies safe? Not just physically, but also mentally, spiritually. Tech has infiltrated our every waking moment. Is it wise to allow it into spiritual lives too? And I'll consider how folks are embracing a new orientation towards technology and the role it plays in our lives. And then, of course, I'll be very curious to hear your comments and questions in the Q&A. So our book, Spirit Tech, explores this arena. We cover 7 different categories of technological innovation, but I'll only highlight a few today because there's so much. In the book, we talk about several different kinds of brain stimulation. We talk about neurofeedback guided meditation, methods of brain-to-brain communication, virtual reality, which has been used to create technodelics that can stimulate altered states of consciousness, and virtual reality Christian church services. We talk about psychedelic substances employed to enhance mystical experiences, and forms of shamanic tourism, which center around psychotropic plants. And then we also talk a little bit about artificial intelligence for providing spiritual guidance. So I'm only going to touch on brain stimulation, neurofeedback, and a little bit on virtual reality today. So some of these technologies are still new and in development, but I really do argue that if we want to understand the future of spirituality, then we need to understand how both the science of the brain and our technological development that's sort of taking the world by storm, how these two things, brain science and tech, are making their ways into people's lives and into people's spiritual meaning-making processes, right? Religion and spiritual quests have always adopted different kinds of embodied techniques, often aided by material objects for connecting with the divine or the spirit or the beyond. And for example, what are mandalas, rosary beads, musical instruments, if not broadly defined, technologies employed to enhance one's spiritual life and encourage spiritual practice or experiences? In fact, spiritual technologies have always co-evolved with human religion. We've got shamans' drums, maracas, tonal chanting, even Sufi whirling, from copies of sort of the Gutenberg Bible made on the printing press to sermons broadcast on the radio or on the TV. In some ways, what we're talking about today is kind of a natural extension or continuation of these techniques. And then also in other ways, of course, it's entirely new and a bit of uncharted territory. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about the particular innovations and how they got started. So since about the 1990s, we've seen exponential growth in the development of brain imaging techniques and scientific knowledge about how the brain works. This is not only super exciting from a scientific point of view, but it's also led to an increased public interest in how the brain can produce emotion, thoughts, dramatic altered states of consciousness, right? Insights about how human thoughts, meditations, prayers, and perceptions, how these are generated in the brain. And then in a feedback loop, how these things affect the brain, the mind, and the body. This knowledge has transformed the way that people think about their inner lives and well-being. In addition, not only are scientists learning about the brain, but then we've got engineers and technologists who are using that brain science to develop tools that can influence brain activity, thereby influencing consciousness, emotions, mental health, and, of course, potentially spiritual well-being. Meanwhile, increasingly, since about maybe the 1970s, people have begun to push away from traditional religions. People's allegiance to those big world religions is shifting. We're talking here about Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam. These traditions, scholars often refer to these as the axial age religions. For many individuals, groups, and even kind of nation states where traditional religions have in the past been the social glue, these traditions are losing their grips a little bit. The stories and the practices of these traditions seem to be less compelling for some people. For various reasons, this is especially the case in high-income countries, like some countries in Europe and the US, and specifically in specific areas, like, for example, the Pacific Northwest is a highly secularizing area. This doesn't really mean, though, that humans are, quote unquote, losing their religion. It does not mean that spiritual and religious impulses that invigorated the traditional religions are somehow disappearing. And it doesn't mean that people don't still believe in gods and spirits and energetic forces. And it does not necessarily mean that traditional religions are disappearing. But what I think it does mean is that we're seeing an emergence of alternative ways of relating to spiritual meaning-making processes alongside of and mixed into those religions. The secularizing process that leads people away from religion is accompanied and sort of comes together with this reinvigoration of spiritual seeking in our communities. As many scholars of religion and contemporary spirituality have argued, we may be seeing a post-secular re-enchantment of human minds, bodies, souls, and communities. So, for example, we're seeing a steady expansion of syncretic spiritual movements. And by syncretic, I just mean the coming together of elements from multiple different types of traditions and ways of thinking. And interest in things like we see energy healing, yoga as spiritual exercise, and organized psychedelic mysticism. I think the technologies that I'm talking about today can be understood as another manifestation sort of this post-secular spirituality. So what do we do when we get, what do we get when we get this mix of this revolution in brain science with this influx of post-secular interest in spirituality, a fascination with the spiritual brain? And indeed, technological applications of spirituality began with scientists using brain sensing and brain imaging equipment to examine the brains of the world's wisest expert meditators and religious practitioners. Monks and nuns and others who have devoted their lives to contemplation and seeking connection with God or enlightenment, and whose daily lives exhibit behavior and the wisdom gleaned from their spiritual practice. These experts' brains have been studied and display markedly different connections between core brain areas. And they produce different brainwave patterns compared to the average person's brain. So, for example, just one example, a brain region called the posterior cingulate cortex, or the PCC, is typically a core functional hub of the default mode network, which kind of kicks in when the brain isn't actively paying attention to anything in the outside world, when a person's brain is just kind of wandering. Excesses in this area can cause rumination, overactive self-referential thinking, ego-based fixations, in other words, suffering. In many ways, meditation is an effort to resist the wandering mind, which is why when you have recorded guided meditations, oftentimes they'll kind of soothingly remind the listener, you know, if your mind begins to wander, simply bring it back to the present moment. That wandering mind happens in that PCC. So typically, the PCC is connected to the default mode network. But the brains of long-term meditators have seemed to be rewired through their practice, and now the PCC is connected to the attention network instead. So when these folks' minds are at rest instead of wandering, their brain looks like they're paying attention to or observing the present moment instead of wandering around ruminating about other things. It's a very clear difference between the typical brain and the brains of master meditators. So their default mode, now master meditators' default mode, is really to be in the world instead of in their head, in a sense. The science of that isn't important for our discussion. It's just kind of one really interesting example that we see from the science. So equipped with findings like these, scientists have found that using things like brain stimulation can help a person's brain enter a meditative state, stimulating specific areas of the brain with electrical currents, magnetic fields, or even more recently, ultrasound beams, can actually nudge a person's brain into the types of states seen in the brains of high-level meditators. So the form of stimulation that might be the most effective, but is still in its developmental stages, is transcranial focused ultrasound stimulation, which is actually what's depicted in this picture. It's being developed by these two men, neuroscientist Jay Sanguinetti and Shinzen Young, who is a Buddhist Shingon monk and an internationally known meditation teacher, along with their team at the Sonication Enhanced Mindfulness Awareness Lab at the University of Arizona. So compared to electromagnetic stimulation, focused ultrasound beams are significantly more precise in their ability to target specific areas and can penetrate much deeper into the brain, which kind of makes it helpful for the particular parts that meditation seems to target. An expert meditator himself, Shinzen was the first to try this ultrasound enhanced meditation protocol. And by the third week of treatment, he said he had one of the most significant effects he's ever had with meditation. And this is after 50 years of practice. So that's pretty profound. Indeed, other participants who had an average of 30 years, they did a small study of expert meditators. They also reported receiving the types of insights that they would expect to get really only after an intensive meditation retreat. So these are experiences that they recognized that they had felt and experienced in their practice, but that came much more easily using the technology. As Shinzen summarized it, he said that experience felt like a deep remembering of what he really was, his true self, and what meditation and the Buddhist path are all about. So in meditation, by quieting that ego self, that wandering mind, and working toward the sense of no self, what he said what is revealed is the true self, which some might call Buddha nature. So an at-home device is sort of Jay and Shinzen's goal, but even though the strength of the stimulation is completely safe on a physical level, it's a really mild stimulation actually, they're very mindful of the psychological and spiritual potency of deep meditative states. These profoundly deep states are advanced. And that's one of the reasons that the whole tradition has been built around these, right? Is because they can be shocking or potentially dangerous. So the traditions have leaders and careful regulatory practices that have been built around meditation. And to help kind of guide people through the types of experiences and insights and even kind of the dark nights of the soul that can arise. So some people may not be prepared to go that deep, and it could be potentially dangerous to encourage or push a brain into those states that a person isn't ready for. So these are the types of questions that Jay and Shinzen are most concerned with before they move forward with their prototype. And I'll talk a little bit more about these kinds of concerns at the end of my talk. Okay, so a second realm of brain research is neurofeedback, and it focuses on brain waves. So researchers have also found that when people are meditating or engaging in certain types of spiritual practices, their brains produce specific brainwave patterns. So brainwaves are rhythmic patterns in the electrical activity of the brain's neurons that can be detected using an encephalography, or EEG, electroencephalography, sorry. Brainwaves frequencies are generally classified into 5 broad categories, ranging from high to low frequency. So we've got, for instance, delta waves, which are the slowest, and they're associated with dreamless sleep, unconsciousness, or unawareness. Then we've got theta waves, which are also associated with sleep, but tend to appear while dreaming, or then awake, but in a state that's of deep relaxation or deep meditation. Theta waves can also be associated with depression, anxiety, and distractibility when they're in areas that we don't desire them. Alpha waves are indicative of the brain at a resting alert state or deep thought. Beta waves are the most common type of brainwave that occurs during normal waking hours when we're alert and attentive and focused on a task or problem. And high beta waves have been associated with hyperalertness or even anxiety sometimes. And then lastly, gamma waves are the fastest and associated with peak concentration and performance, high levels of cognitive processing and mental acuity. So it's easy to see why some types of waves are more desirable than others for very specific activities and goals and at certain times. If you're trying to fall asleep, for example, you wouldn't want to be filled with distracting beta wave activity, right? On the other hand, if you're a concert pianist about to give a performance, you want some beta waves. Those are going to come in handy, keep you focused, keep you alert. Researchers have identified specific brainwave distribution patterns that are produced during specific mental states like anxiety, hyperfocus, chronic distraction. Even folks who have ADHD, we see particular patterns emerge. So for example, ADHD might be characterized by slower wave activity in the frontal lobe when you actually need faster wave activity to focus and pay attention. So one neurofeedback clinician I interviewed compared brain waves to an orchestra seeking harmony. Each brain area and each frequency, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, each of these can be conceptualized as kind of a different instrument in the orchestra. Each one is important, each one is necessary, but each one may be potentially in need of tuning as well as volume or timing regulation. And life is full of movements that require sort of this crescendos or diminuendos and expressive rhythmic freedom. So by carefully studying these brainwave patterns of expert meditators, scientists have also identified patterns that the brains tend to produce during deep meditative states. One pioneer in this area called a particular meditative pattern the awakened mind, and he saw this over and over in different types of expert spiritual folks' minds. So, using this research, neurofeedback technology, using this research on brainwaves, neurofeedback technology is sort of a non-invasive way or a guide to produce the desired brainwave patterns. So non-invasive, meaning it doesn't actually send any form of stimulation into the brain. The stimulation is sort of auditory or visual. So instead, it kind of rewards the brain for producing the target brainwaves with either visual or audio feedback. If the goal state is set to the meditative brainwave patterns, then the neurofeedback system will sense the brainwaves that a person is producing and will offer positive reinforcement to the brain to encourage the brain to do more of that desired brainwave activity. So it's kind of like playing hot and cold with the brain. The feedback is saying, getting warmer, more of that with positive sounds and visuals. The sounds, the first time I heard the sounds, I thought they were kind of annoying, but apparently your brain finds them very rewarding, right? These kind of beeps. And a visual that might be rewarding is a visual of a blooming flower. Your brain actually wants to see that flower bloom. The brain, sort of unconscious to you, responds by producing more of the desired brainwaves. So the person receiving the feedback just kind of sits quietly and observes their mind doing this work. Neurofeedback can kind of tune the frequencies and revitalize the brain's natural ability to be flexible and present and responsive to environmental stimuli. The people that I interviewed who have used neurofeedback guided meditation say that it has had an absolutely transformative and healing effect on their lives. And both of the people that I'm kind of thinking of that kind of came into my mind went into it with a lot of skepticism and were not sure if this was worth their time, right? But there are a few neurofeedback clinicians around the country that offer specifically neurofeedback guided meditation in their clinics. With like super customized protocols and personal minute-to-minute coaching. The protocols can be very personalized and change depending on the needs and requirements of the person who's receiving the feedback. For example, pictured here is Dr. Jeff Tarrant at the Neuromeditation Institute in Eugene, Oregon. And then the other emblem there is from, Richard Suter's New Mind Neurofeedback in Georgia. Richard Suter is actually a fascinating pioneer of neurofeedback in general, and of neurofeedback guided meditation in particular also. So done this way, a wise clinician, who is also an experienced meditator themselves, both of these men are, and the people who do this clinician kind of acts as a sort of spiritual guide of sorts to lead a person toward a state that will facilitate healing and insight toward those meditative states. One of the men I interviewed who uses neurofeedback for meditation referred to Dr. Suter as a true bodhisattva, which is a term from Mahayana Buddhism that refers to a person who has achieved the requisite qualities to enter nirvana or Buddhahood, but resists and stays back and is motivated by a deep compassion to delay their own liberation in order to help bring other people to achieve enlightenment. So this person calling Dr. Suter a bodhisattva was a high compliment, of course. So whether or not you want to call a doctor a bodhisattva, the point is that Dr. Suter, with the help of this technology, played an incredibly meaningful and healing role in this person's life, who had suffered for years from PTSD and moral injury from experiences in the military. So, okay, in addition to neurofeedback and brain stimulation in a setting with a guide, in a clinical or a lab setting, your other entrepreneurs have sort of designed home use devices for people who are looking to bring these technologies into their homes. And for some entrepreneurs, this is the main goal, right? Bringing the technology out of the labs and clinics and into people's hands has become their vocational calling. The Muse brain sensing headband is pictured here, and it's a sleek and increasingly popular headset designed to improve meditation practice. It provides neurofeedback. It's one of the most popular at-home spiritual technologies right now. It has 7 brainwave sensors on the band that runs across the forehead there, and an accelerometer to track body movement. It has a gyroscope to track breathing, and an oximeter to track heart rate. It also pairs wirelessly with your smartphone, and provides recorded guided meditation and feedback soundscapes for to track your goals and progress. So, of course, compared to working with someone like Dr. Suter or Dr. Tarrant, it's significantly less sophisticated and not really customizable. But there's something, so there is something lost there, right? But there is potentially something gained. It's affordable. It's about $250, and it seems to work decently well for what people want from it. And then also for brain stimulation, we actually do have a couple sets. We're still waiting for Jay and Shinzen's at-home ultrasound device, but there are a few available. This one is called the Zendo meditation headset that emits direct current of electricity called transcranial direct current stimulation through the brain. And it works by sending the current between those 2 patches that you see, one over the right eyebrow and one over the left temple. And it says that it can be 2.5 times more powerful than conventional meditation training. So generally, users seem to have found that it leaves them feeling calmer, less physically, mentally restless, and more focused, more able to meditate. So we're seeing these kinds of things pop up all over. The third kind of application of technology that I want to touch on are those that are devoted to creating new sacred spaces. I'm especially intrigued by these because most of my scholarly work focuses on ritual as the heart of religious and spiritual systems. So ritual, of course, can be broadly defined. As we know, religion is not just about what happens inside an individual's mind. It's also about the cultivation of things like community and connections between people, and the celebration of those communities and connections with rituals and within sacred spaces. So while we may think immediately of things like cathedrals and mosques and shrines when we think of sacred places, contemporary scholars of religion really make the point to show that we really see sacred space throughout people's lives, right? This isn't to say that sacred spaces just happen or that they're not intentional. I would say they are very intentional, but we create sacred moments and sacred spaces by doing simple things like dimming the lights, lighting candles or incense, or by joining hands with other people, by saying a prayer, playing beautiful music, or even just kind of breathing in the pure mountain air with gratitude and awe, right? Those are kind of on the fly creation of sacred spaces. So along these lines, many folks within the spirit tech field of innovation are well aware of this and have begun exploring different ways that technology might be able to enhance and facilitate sacred spaces and human connection. And these folks are really convinced that human connection is kind of the core spiritual value. So, for example, the founder of the international community called Consciousness Hackers, Mikey Siegel, who also happened to write the foreword for our book Spirit Tech, he's created what he calls group flow. It involves a set of technologies that can be hooked up in various ways, depending on the goals of the particular gathering. For example, some configurations are designed to enhance a sense of group togetherness, while others are designed to facilitate intimate connections between two people, whether that's an intimate or romantic partner, or even just a stranger. Both of these kinds of experiences, whether intimate or a stranger, can be spiritually meaningful experiences. But the overall point of group flow, of this kind of set of technologies, is group consciousness, communal spiritual connection, and interpersonal intimacy. So Siegel himself kind of calls this a permissioning tool that creates a setting or a mode, a space that people can enter into to become, to open up more, become less defended, so that they can be more real and more vulnerable with themselves and others. And of course, these are, classic goals, but just done in a new way with Spirit Tech. In essence, it's a ritualized spiritual gathering. Let's see if I can play this. That involves electrodes, wires, flashing lights, and electronic sounds, all with this goal of enhancing deeply honest, life-giving connection between participants. So I know it's hard to picture, so even with this picture, so I'll just kind of explain a couple ways that it's used. I spoke with 3 people who participated in a group flow retreat at Esalen. Esalen is this famous spiritual retreat center in California. And I also spoke with Mikey Siegel, of course, and this is how they kind of described it. First, before participants enter into the yurt where all this tech was set up, they were ceremoniously smudged with sage to kind of clear their energy, set the tone and intention for the gathering. And then once inside, everyone was initiated or anointed with electrodes. So even just handling something like electrode sensors, which you typically only really see in a medicalized setting, handling these with this kind of new type of care and gentleness, people said it really worked. It created a sense of reverence for what was about to happen and encouraged a different relationship with the technology, right? So as part of a ceremony, even something that's typically experienced as medical or cold can take on new symbolic meaning. As you can see, once they step inside, participants see in the middle here kind of a glowing sphere. It's consisting of 300 LED lights, which can provide visual feedback to the group, representing the group's shared experience. And then in front of each person, there's a small glowing orb, which can represent and display an individual's heartbeat or their breath. So that's kind of the individual reflection. Sometimes synchronization of either heartbeat or breath is the goal. And the idea is to feel unified with those people that are around you. Other times, the goal, the goal of the meeting is interpersonal connection, one-on-one connection, and even meditating on the uniqueness of your own orb, which may symbolize your heart, and then sharing it, even entrusting it to the partner that you're sitting with. So the goal of this type of ritual is a radical acceptance and even love for yourself and for the other person that you're working with. So to get there, the facilitator directs the participants in kind of a slow and mindful process that recognizes the humanness of the other, encourages partners to kind of meditate on the possible heartaches and joys and love that their partner's heart has been through. Again, the way that the participants are directed to interact with that orb encourages that sense of reverence and connection. and again, remarkably effective for generating these feelings. One person said that she had had a really hard time connecting with the orb as her heart until she gave it to her partner. And it was at that point that she got it, and she felt incredibly moved by the recognition, by her partner's recognition of her heart symbolized in this orb. Okay, I could talk about each of these forever, but moving on. Also, another newly sacred space is virtual space through the use of VR headsets. So this can be imagined in several different ways. And again, each one is so cool and worth talking about. But for example, there are churches that exist entirely within VR. If you're interested in that, check out one called VR Church, led by Pastor DJ Soto. And that's the screenshots here are from VR Church. And second, but totally different, there are what is called technodelics, which are virtual reality programs designed to generate altered states of consciousness, psychedelic-like transcendental or even mystical experiences. Technodelics in general are absolutely fascinating, really incredible. For now, I'll point you into the direction of Sound Self. If you're interested in that kind of thing, check out Sound Self. It's a technodelic program designed by Robin Arnott. It uses this hypnotic, swirling, strobing, tunnels of visions, tunnels of light visuals that respond to and morph along with the sound of your voice. So at the beginning of the program, you're directed to take a deep breath and kind of make a sustained tonal sound, oh, and you can change the tone of your sound. The program picks this up, generates the visuals that respond with your toning, and it's an incredible kind of engulfing experience, because in virtual reality, you're in that space, right? So it is on the market, and you can buy it for about $30. Of course, the VR headset is a little bit more expensive than that, but they do have a version that doesn't require a VR headset, although I do imagine that the VR version would be dramatically more effective for creating an encompassing experience. Okay, but for now, I just want to mention another intriguing virtual space program called ISNES. It is a program created by a team that's led by a scientist named David Glowacki of the University of Bristol. It is a multi-person VR journey. So I'm going to play this video. Never plays when I want it to play. There we go. Okay. We don't need the sound. I'm going to talk to you. It represents each participant to the other participants as these colorful, glowing, energetic essences, rather than traditional avatars that we saw in the VR church, right? So the goal of ISNES is to induce a mystical type experience. And such spiritual experiences are often characterized by a sense of connectedness, transcendence, ineffability for each individual. And then also as a group, they experience the collective emergence, fluctuation, and dissipation of their and each other's bodies as energetic essences. So even though the people in the physical space are wearing VR headsets, each headset has access to global positioning data, so they can see and interact with the VR representations of the other participants. Each person has what are called mudra gloves on, equipped with a tracking device also. So people can reach out and touch hands with others during the experience, touch hands with other folks' energetic presences. So there's similar to group flow, there's kind of a set of different parameters that can be manipulated depending on the way that the program is being used and the sort of ritual that they want to facilitate. And the facilitators are able to construct a journey for the participants through 13 different phenomenological states modeled after concepts that are emerging out of the psychedelic drug research. So things like matter as energy, connectedness, unity, ego dissolution, transcendence of time and space, and a noetic quality. So this is, in my mind, this is an award-winning project. It's not yet available on the market, but there's no reason to think that something like this, whether it's this or something else, wouldn't eventually be available at some point and create meaningful experiences. Okay, So now that we've heard a few of these tech applications, which are really only the tip of the iceberg, I want to reflect on just some of the biggest questions that are probably coming to mind for some of you, and then we can talk about those a little bit more in the question and answer if you have specific comments or questions. First, what about those precious 10,000 hours that one needs to become an expert or learn a skill like meditation, right? Are we reducing the value of these experiences, the value of those hours to a push of a button? Like, does that cheapen the experience a little bit? Is it hubris to think that the struggle to learn the meditative process can be skipped? Secondly, more generally, are these technologies a good idea for individuals, for communities? You know, people might be saying it's one thing to let technology infiltrate our workplaces, our dinner tables, even our bedrooms. Is it? But now technology is like coming for our sacred spaces and our most personal depths of inner experience. And a lot of people have a really negative reaction to that. So is that wise, right? And then third, of course, can these technologies really help generate authentic religious experience? So first, is it a cheap shortcut? Spirit tech innovators believe that it is, in theory, possible to see and understand the effects of meditation as they physically manifest in the brain. And so theoretically, manipulating the brain into those physical states would produce the corresponding mental state, right? And the spiritual benefits. This is really a fairly simple cause and effect model. And yet, if you think about it, it also requires a jump, right? It's a jump from a complex Buddhist philosophical phenomenological concept such as enlightenment or no self or equanimity. You've got these rich concepts. So to jump from that to a specific activation of a neuronal network requires some thought, right? But it is exactly this type of kind of crisscrossing and contemplating the relationship between these philosophical concepts and brain science. That's what excites spirit tech innovators the most. It's also what concerns them the most. So especially innovators like Shinzen Young and Jay Sanguinetti, they talk specifically about this problem, and they are both absolutely committed to grappling with it as much as they need to before ever making an ultrasound brain stimulation meditation headset widely available. So, yeah. And I think especially Shinzen has this decades of meditation and teaching experience. He's especially equipped to understand the nuances of this issue. This is not really an issue that has an answer yet. So essentially I'm saying if you've had this concern, you're right on track, right? In addition, for the technology to be really contributing to well-being, they believe that it should be a techno boost and not a motor that does it for you, right? The idea is that the technology should eventually teach your brain to access the meditative states on its own without the aid. In this way, stimulation is more, and neurofeedback are more of like training wheels rather than a motor. Eventually, if the meditator gains experience and practice with the training wheels, with the stimulation or neurofeedback, they'll gain the neuronal pathways and move toward actually eliminating the need for the training wheels. So there's a sense in which we're talking about some shortcuts that might be worth it if they're temporary, right? For folks on the ground who are really innovating and who are buying these technologies and using them in their lives, the insight and the wisdom that those spiritual goals are foremost. But they have the approach that if scientific findings and these interventions, these technological interventions can help them get there, then they think kind of, what's the problem? For example, at a spiritual retreat that featured all the classic things, yoga, organic meals, trauma release rituals, and body work, along with neurofeedback and brain stimulation. This was a retreat put out by Brainworks Neurofeedback. One attendee that I spoke with told me the story. She asked the facilitator, the person who was doing neurofeedback with her, she said, so why am I doing all this? Can't I just do yoga and meditate and transform that way? And he said, well, yeah, you can, but it would take you 10 years to do the work that we're doing here. So in this way, spirit tech innovators and users are kind of celebrating the words of the Dalai Lama, who once said at a neuroscience conference, if it was possible to become free of negative emotions by a riskless implantation of an electrode without impairing intelligence and the critical mind, I would be the first patient. So, construed broadly, the ability to create technology is one of the core things that sets humans apart from other animals. Beavers build dams, wild gorillas use twigs as tools to draw ants out of a nest, chimpanzees and macaques use stones as hammers to break open nuts. But the extent of our technological creativity is the trademark of Homo sapiens. We do it more than any other animal by far. We have stone tools, cars, internet. Technologies shape our lives just as much as we're shaping technologies. But technologies are tools. They're just tools. They're powerful and potentially dangerous tools and should be handled with care. So this comes to the question of safety, right? In other words, scientific advancements and the technological potentialities they carry are rarely in and of themselves harmful or beneficial. It all just depends on how they're designed and how they're implemented and utilized. So for example, the scientific discovery of nuclear fission enabled the atomic bomb, right? But it also made possible a relatively sustainable form of energy for our communities. So similarly, there's a potential for harm that spirit tech holds. Spirit tech innovators believe they have a responsibility, and they absolutely do, to harness the positive potential and to do it right. How to do it right is the hard question. So will there be wolves in sheep clothing? Without a doubt. Absolutely. I'm sure there already are. Will there be incredible life-giving and healing applications of this technology? I hope so, right? Spirit tech innovators are totally determined to make the answer to that question yes. And frankly, for all our sakes, I hope they do. I hope they're right. As I explained earlier, technologies reflect the values brought to them by their developers and engineers. So I think that one of the most important pivot points here in determining whether or not a certain technology is safe or wise is to be mindful in discerning the values and intentions of the tech's creators. For example, if the creators are motivated primarily by their company's profits, they're more likely to make a product that people need to continue to use and upgrade again and again, right? Something that becomes almost addictive, like cell phones. But if they're motivated by a more holistic wellness and spiritual freedom approach, if that's their goal, then they're likely to create something that serves more like training wheels and then actually makes itself irrelevant as the person advances and past it. So, in other words, technology designed to exploit our weaknesses and deficits will never provide long-term benefits. But tech designed with compassion and wisdom to heal deficits is a different thing. Okay, so lastly, for the people discovering the science of spirituality and developing tech for spiritual practice, the goals of tech-enhanced spiritual practice are identical to traditional religious goals, such as equanimity, love, compassion, peacefulness, mindfulness. And the fact that something like, for example, equanimity may for some purposes be operationalized scientifically as the downregulation and retraining of the posterior cingulate cortex, this doesn't take away from the depth, meaning, and transformative potential of that experience. For example, some may think that science is reductive, right? They may think that a scientific approach says that a mystical experience is just a brain misfiring or playing tricks. However, I really do think that this is a misunderstanding of the science. Scientific discoveries themselves may occasionally contribute to evaluation of specific beliefs. For example, some beliefs say that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. Science says otherwise, right? There are places where science and religion can conflict. But a neuroscientific approach to a spiritual experience really has no bearing on the authenticity of the spiritual experience itself. For people engaging with the types of technologies that we're talking about, the ability to see and influence those spiritual states doesn't explain them away or make them any less meaningful. And really, the fact that we can see those states doesn't really have any bearing on the reality of gods or spirits or spiritual energies. So these things can be just as real or not. and experiences enhanced by technology can be just as genuine and transformative potentially. So when evaluating authenticity, rather than fretting too much about how the experience comes about, whether it's through years of dedicated practice or through the help of a spirit tech device, instead, innovators tend to say, hey, look at the fruits of the practice or the experience. Do they measure up? Is the spiritual practice facilitating the form of spiritual transformation and the types of spiritual insights desired? Is it generating spiritual well-being and healing? Is the technology enhancing these goals, or is it hindering them? Religious traditions have all sorts of lists of moral virtues that they seek to cultivate in their followers, right? For example, the Christian tradition has the fruits of the Holy Spirit, which are love, joy, peace, patience, these kinds of things. And the Buddhist tradition has the Noble Eightfold Path, right? The idea is that if one's spiritual practice is authentic, proof will be in the pudding, right? Their lives will reflect the insight and the wisdom gleaned from that spiritual life. So along these lines, I met a woman named Carol Griggs, who is a well-known figure in the transformative technology and consciousness evolution world. And she stressed the importance of creating technologies that achieve actual shifts in one's stage of spiritual development. So she compared, she values stage shifts as the evidence of authentic spiritual experience, which are long-lasting embodied transformations, over and above state changes, which are more like cool altered states of consciousness, right? So while perhaps these cool altered states of consciousness are impressive and even really very meaningful, they're not necessarily the fully authentic religious experience or spiritual experience. Okay, so I'll wrap up here since I'd love to hear your comments, but I hope you'll take at least two main points from the talk just to first gather from this brief introduction that these technologies are out there, they're really interesting, they're worth paying attention to for religious scholars, I think. And we see in this a new merging of brain science, technological innovation, spirituality. We're seeing a new relationship, basically, between religion and science. Many people are no longer operating with this sense that these two ways of knowing, science and religion, are in conflict, right? Which opens up this huge space for technological innovation. However, the second point is that with this new and inevitably rocky terrain, it deserves the attention of not only the entrepreneurs, but also scholars and ethicists and theologians and thoughtful minds who are able to discern the complicated dangers of these extremely powerful tools, right? These voices are especially integral, I think, for the conversations that need to continue around this work. So while fear seems to get us nowhere, balancing excitement with this careful caution and wisdom appears to be key. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that fascinating lecture. And I have a few questions myself, but I want to open it to the crowd here, to the audience. If anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand electronically, preferably. But if not, if you don't know how to raise your hand electronically, feel free to write it in the chat box and I'll reiterate your questions. So I'm opening stage for people to ask questions. Jonathan.
Am I unmuted? Cool. Kate, thank you. That was really awesome and kind of unsettling or terrifying and exciting, a blend of emotions. I guess my question is a little tangential. If it's too tangential, feel free to ignore it. But I was wondering if you ran into people using these sorts of technologies for other skills, like if I was a musician or a sniper or a judge or learning a language, were people using these things for these other skills to get similar sorts of boosts? And if so, I was thinking about whether that in some ways normalizes spiritual experiences as this thing that we can gain a little more control over, and whether that would become a threatening thing for certain traditions or certain people, whether you ran into any of that.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. I think Absolutely. First of all, before I think before the spiritual applications became, um, I'm distracted by the fact that my text messages are dinging, and I thought I closed that. So if it starts dinging more, then I'll silence them. Um, but yeah, absolutely. So peak performance, of course, has been this been a goal, I guess, of a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs for a long time, and they've used whatever methods they can to get faster, stronger, more productive, more efficient, more all of these goals that benefit basically companies, right? And personal wellness and things like that. And I think that there's a fine line, right, between um, peak performance, which can be a very ego-driven task or ego-driven goal, and then spiritual wellness, which is supposed to be sort of the opposite of that, right? And there sometimes is a little blurring between those two. So, for example, neurofeedback, brain stimulation, these things have all been utilized for peak performance training, which and for medical applications, things like the treatment of ADHD, for example. And if you don't have ADHD, you might still use neurofeedback just to fine tune your attention so that you can think more clearly and faster and more efficient, right? Um, but so the idea is then that these technologies, especially, have been not only used to kind of correct deficits, but then also to boost people past the point um, of average or of health. You know, they want something more better than health, and so that's sort of happened first, I think, before the spiritual applications, and now the spiritual applications are building on that, but also trying to resist explicitly. There are folks who talk about this, trying to resist those ego driven kind of obsession with peak performance. So the what that kind of means is that the design of the technology would need to shift a little bit to um, less so much goal driven, right, and more a more holistic driving force. That's a really actually a very difficult design problem to have, because the tech that we're familiar with, even things like the Muse headband, has sets goals for you, and you see how close you approximated that goal, um, and it can be kind of almost like a stress inducing thing, because you think, oh, I'm so bad at meditating, you know, I'm stressed out about that, I'm not doing it well enough, which is sort of the opposite of what we want people to feel about the spiritual journey, right? Because it was sort of modeled first as this effort for peak performance. So yeah, then the second part of your question about normalizing the spiritual path, I do think that that's kind of happening to a certain point. You know, I think that like our community's interest in wellness has has slowly over the years really adopted a spiritual dimension, a spiritual element to it. And maybe at first, you know, like when I was talking about kind of the well, I guess I didn't talk about too much, but kind of the rise of new age spiritual practices, you know, maybe at first those were seen as kind of hippie and weird, but slowly they really are making their way into the mainstream wellness communities. I mean, we see even like transcendental meditation has now been secularized, and the relaxation response that many people learn in medical school to help with stress reduction, that is actually transcendental meditation, just secularized, you know? So in a sense, um, there's two things happening. There's like the sort of secularization of these spiritual practices, which I think could be experienced as very offensive to many people who maybe learned these spiritual practices in a traditional sense. So it's like a Western appropriation of these. And then there's also this sense in which it almost kind of finally, at least maybe I'm kind of revealing my bias here, but finally, Western biomedicine is understanding the wisdom that's held in some of these traditional practices. And so it is sort of normalizing the fact that, like, look, we do have a mind body connection, and that is important for our wellness and things like that. So, yeah, I don't know if that got to your question, but that's what I think.
Yeah, yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anyone else? Any other questions? Connor, thanks.
Helps to unmute yourself first. Thanks, Kate. This is Dr. Stockley. Normally we're pretty formal with our speakers, but we all some of us went to grad school with Kate, so with Dr. Stockley. So my question is, how do I get rid of my hand now that I'm asking the question? Okay, there we go. This way of doing spiritual experiences, I would like to know what you think about how it fits with sort of classical religious studies approaches to religion, as what Emil Durkheim would call an eminently social phenomenon, right? Like, and I even wrote down in my notes here, I've got something about homo duplex, right? Like Durkheim's idea that we have this dual nature, one of which is organismic and individual, and the other is social and like playing roles and things like that. And he and many other scholars have put religion more on that second side of the social side of the homo duplex. But a lot of these technologies seem to point much more closely towards the organismic pole, the individual pole. You're talking about individual experiences. You're directly manipulating brain states and neural net and cortical networks and so forth. So that's one aspect of it. The second, glowing on that, the research on how meditation alters the default mode network, right? Like the posterior cingulate cortex, and sort of shifts it from being tightly linked to the default mode network to attention networks. That's a fascinating change. But the default mode network is not just like mind wandering, right? It's increasingly understood that the default mode network is mostly a social cognition network. It's what you use to think about people. Daydreaming, mostly when we're daydreaming, that lights up because we're thinking about people, and it's what we use to understand other people's motives or intentions and so forth. So how does this fit in? This seems like a kind of spirituality that's deeply individual focused rather than
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that question, because that too, as Connor mentioned, we were trained in a similar program. So I'm Durkheimian. Like in my scholarly approach as a scholar of religion, that's the approach that I take, is that religion is a social phenomenon. That is what it is, right? So I would say that what we're seeing here is kind of the nascent stages of what might become more of something that we would call that we would put into the category of religion, right? So there's no religion, spirit tech religion yet, and I don't know, maybe there won't be. In fact, who knows what sort of like the next phase of religion will look like. But I definitely agree that it's that we cannot understand religion without understanding the social parts, which is why I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the ritual aspects and the ways that people are kind of trying to use spirit tech in ritual spaces or to cultivate ritual spaces, because I think that's really important too. And not talking about that is not talking about religion. You're talking about something else. You're talking about interesting brain experiences, right? That people can find very spiritually meaningful, but in terms of religion, we're missing a ton. So the person who wrote the foreword for the book, I mentioned him. He's the creator of Group Flow. His name is Mikey Siegel. He's been part of this. He's also the founder of Consciousness Hackers and one of the co-founders of the Transformative Technology Lab and the Awaken Future Conference. Like, he's in it, he's doing this. He actually stopped really working with any technologies that aren't group focused and focused on connection and human, and kind of like building that sense of collective effervescence, right? Because he saw, not because he's a scholar of religion at all, because he's not. We had great conversations because we come from such different worlds. He's actually across the river from us. He was trained at MIT as a roboticist. So, but he came upon that through his own experiences, right? He realized that what people are really like, the spiritual yearning that's kind of underneath and really driving the seeker activity, is that need for connection and that need for understanding oneself as part of a larger community, right? So group flow, actually, the way that people describe their experiences with group flow is, it seems that he's fairly successfully generated what we would call collective effervescence, and this kind of this recognition of group cohesion and consciousness. So I have a couple quotes here. I was actually just looking at them right before, but I won't read them unless they seem really pertinent. But anyways, yeah. So basically, what I'm trying to say there is that there are many spirit tech entrepreneurs who are deeply interested and invested in exactly what you're talking about, in recognizing that aspect of religion and spirituality and forefronting that. But you're absolutely right also that a lot of the technological developments have been individual experiences. If you're using a brain stimulation headset, you're the only one using it. Although interestingly, if you look at the kind of the history of something like neurofeedback, especially neurofeedback, the use of neurofeedback for spiritual practice, for spiritual settings, actually started within a group setting, and everybody was training together with one guide who would coach the group together. And I think each person had their own, what they called at the time, mind mirror. And this was sort of more, I think this is in the 70s. But it was a very communal experience, and done in a setting, a group setting. So it's interesting. I think, like I said, I think it's young. I think that we'll see how it develops. And it's interesting to see how the spirit tech innovators themselves are invested in cultivating group experiences and social spaces for this. Second, your mention of the posterior cingulate cortex. So absolutely, all of these brain regions are incredibly complex, and I think and very difficult, right, to narrow down. We know that there's not like a God spot in the brain any more than there's a meditation spot in the brain. But the posterior cingulate cortex example was just one. In fact, that is not even the area of the brain that was targeted in Shinzen Young and the other expert meditators' protocol for meditation. They were actually targeting the basal ganglia. So I could have used a different example. Basically, they find lots of different shifts and changes that take place in the brains of expert meditators. And then they've identified through various different ways which areas of the brain they want to target. And I think they've tried out multiple different protocols. I think the basal ganglia target was the most successful, but that might not be the case anymore. They might be doing other protocols now. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Connor. Seth, and after that, Dave.
And then it looks like Anna and Stan Mayra are also raising their hand too.
Right. Got it.
All right. My question has to do with kind of susceptibility to influence and the way that it kind of plays in these technologies. So I couldn't help but think a lot about hypnosis and about how hypnosis depends a lot on the individual person who's being hypnotized and how well they can visualize things, how much imagination they have to really lean into the experience. And it would seem that you could see it as just kind of a displacement of, say, a hypnotist for a technological device that's prompting someone to feel a certain way, and then maybe there's a kind of placebo effect going on. So I guess for the technologists themselves, how are they kind of looking to verify that they're creating these kinds of experiences? Because I couldn't help but just think about that, especially as, if people really want to believe in these kinds of technologies, then I'm sure if we looked, we could probably find instances of that. So how, like, what have you seen in that area?
Yeah, such a good question, Seth. So, well, first of all, it's very difficult, right, to verify the effectiveness of technologies like this, right? Of course. I think it's more doable, more verifiable when you're in the office, a clinic, or a lab with folks who are guiding you and watching your brain in the moment, right? You've got brain imaging that's happening moment to moment. You're seeing things happen. And then you're trusting, especially if if you're using expert meditators who understand themselves what a deep meditative state feels like. They felt this tons of times. They know what it feels like. They have really less, well, I don't know, they might be just as motivated to experience this and just as susceptible for sure. But, you know, the idea is kind of repetition and sort of verifying over many trials. But I would also say it's really interesting because, for example, the direct current stimulation, the direct current electrical stimulation headset has subsequent studies, some studies show that it's very effective. Some studies show that it's not, and some studies show that it is doing something. It seems to be effective, but the mechanism at play, like how the electrical stimulation is actually affecting the brain, is completely unclear. And it looks as though actually the stimulation isn't affecting the brain, right? So it might be, we just don't actually know that much about the brain yet. So it might be actually doing something that we actually can't really see or detect, because the point is that folks who put this on, do experience some benefit from it, right? So who's to say, right, if it's just that we don't quite understand the brain yet, or if this is quote unquote the placebo effect. And I think the placebo effect is fantastic. I'll use the placebo effect all day if it's going to heal me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, just as kind of a follow-up, because I know you mentioned the story of someone, say, when they're trying to get into that group flow state, they were only able to get into it once they did a certain kind of visualization. And I guess that really brought to mind, say, you could run experiments with Confederates, right? Using things that are really similar and kind of setting up situations with a blinking orb and a person and very convincing, oh, wow, we're really syncing up and that sort of thing. So like I couldn't help but thinking that as a really good scam, so to speak, just because I think some people are like so willing to go into it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, at a certain point too, though, what's being harnessed in group flow, their brains aren't being affected by anything. They're not being stimulated. And group flow might at some point incorporate a neurofeedback type um, uh, protocol, but it doesn't yet. They're actually just harnessing the ability for people to connect, right? And they're sort of creating a space and using the technology to create this symbolic meaning and this interaction and this kind of ritual modality that allows the human interaction, like the power and the potency of just two humans interacting and sharing space with each other and reflecting on each other's heart and joys and pain and sorrow, these kinds of things. So that is just true. I mean, that's just real stuff. Sure, you could be a con man and you could go in and say that you love somebody and that you care about somebody, but and they might actually experience you as very genuine and you might not be genuine. But I think that I mean, that's always the case. Like I said, there's always going to be charlatans and snake oil salesmen, but especially for the group flow setting, that's just human connection being cultivated, and being symbolized through these tech. So yeah, it's a little bit of everything, a little bit of both.
Thanks a lot, Seth. Dave, and after that, Anna and Stan.
Thank you, Dr. Stockley, for that really fascinating presentation. I want to ask a question you probably won't want to answer, but I want to put you to it anyways. And that's basically, if you had to put money on it, if you had to put $1,000 on it, which of the technologies you examine in the book do you think is most likely to have a transformative effect on religion and spirituality, say in the next 50 years? And why?
Yeah, that is a hard question. It's really hard to say. It's also, I would say, also a different question, like which technology do I think is most potentially transformative for individuals? Like if you had this at your home, could it help you? Could it transform your life? Versus which one is actually going to transform like the religious landscape that we exist in? I want to say that oh, I the virtual reality applications are really fascinating, but I almost kind of feel like if they were going to take off, they would have already, because virtual reality is already kind of out there and in the ethos, in the ether. So maybe I won't say that. I do think that the ultrasound brain stimulation, it's one of the ones that I talk about pretty frequently because I think it has this like really incredible potential, and I really trust, or I admire, let me say, the approach that Jay Sanguinetti and Shinzen Yang bring to their work, and I think that they're doing it right. And so if they come out with a product at some point and they say, okay, we think this is ready, I'd probably be compelled to buy it, right? Just because I'm like, okay, they're really doing the work. They're doing the philosophical work. They're doing the ethical work. They're doing the science. I mean, they're really incredible researchers. So I don't expect that to happen very soon because they're doing it right, is what I would say. So religion, like religious landscape, affecting the history of religion or the future of religion. I think that the general kind of new negotiation that we're seeing sort of between religion and science, and between spiritual ways of knowing and ways of conceptualizing the world and the body and the mind and the self, balancing with new ways of scientific ways of knowing. So these spiritual ways of knowing, these scientific ways of knowing, the fact that these two are finally kind of like coming together and we're seeing how we can make meaning with both of these knowledge sources together, I think will and is absolutely transforming the way that religion exists in the world, the way that people practice religion in their daily lives, the way that they think about themselves and their bodies and what it means to have an experience, you know? So that piece is almost the most exciting for me. It's just kind of like the tech themselves are these little manifestations that may come and go as we're navigating this new territory and these new kind of philosophical spaces that are coming about. So yeah, that's a little bit of an answer, non-answer to your question, but that's what I would say.
Thanks a lot, Dave. Stan, you're still muted.
Maybe I want to stay that way. I don't know. Hi, Kate, Dave.
Hi.
Gosh, I wish you would have stopped by and shook my hand, Dave, and all that. But anyway, I've got my bib on. I did some red salmon processing this afternoon, so I don't know where that ranks me on my spiritual development, but we have some good food coming. Hey, Kate, I've always enjoyed talking with you, and gosh, you're such a beautiful girl and able to express yourself so well. And we always share authors and experiences and stuff. But this realm that you're in here is really quite exciting in that you're exploring all kinds of different modalities and possibilities for our development. The thing that I wanted to just throw out there is, I haven't read your book yet, but coming across the hard problem of consciousness from a scientific perspective is sort of an entree to spirituality from a scientific perspective. That we study the brain, we study this, but is brain really, is consciousness a function of the brain, or is consciousness beyond the brain? Or some people like Don Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup, and others are saying really that is the reality out there, is consciousness. Are you gearing up more for consciousness, an exploration of consciousness, not just as a function of the brain, but consciousness and awareness unto itself? I guess I'll stop there. But I guess I don't know if I have a question, but I need to hear a little bit more from you, maybe from your personal experience, or Dr. Wesley's, or anybody else that wants to talk about maybe some of the things I just threw out there. So how's that for a fisherman?
Thank you.
I love it.
Thank you, Stan, and good luck. Good luck with that, Kate.
Yeah.
You don't have to say anything, Kate.
Yeah. Well, I'll say a few things because it is really interesting, and I think that one of the things that's most exciting, I think, about this is that I've always loved science, and I've always been fascinated by religion, and had my own kind of spiritual and religious outlooks, and in the forward of Spirit Tech, I talk a little bit about how, you know, Spirit Tech is kind of finally one of these spaces where my personal interests get to kind of come together with my scholarly interests. So it is always, you know, I'm a human too. Like listening to people's experiences, hearing them talk about the transformations that happen in their lives, you know, it's inevitable that you're also going to kind of think about your own life and where your own kind of thoughts and understandings of consciousness fit into this. And some of the most inspiring stories that I heard throughout the research were from folks, for instance, you know, I met the inventor of the microprocessor, like literally the person who invented the microprocessor that makes all of our computers work. He was obviously this brilliant computer scientist, and he had a spiritual experience, an experience.
And what was his name again?
Um,
I know I was just he's Italian, isn't he?
yes, it's
Oh,
not coming to my mind.
yeah, yeah. He's a good guy to listen to.
Yeah, yeah,
And he was really science, and then he's had some pretty amazing experiences as well
yes.
in the consciousness end of things. Yeah.
And he left behind basically. So it's at the beginning. Oh, you know, it's like right on the tip of my tongue. It's one of those things. You know, he left behind basically his computer science career. I mean, I think at that
Right.
point he probably had plenty of success to retire successfully.
Yeah. Yes.
But in order to pursue the science of consciousness, and so it really was, you know, this situation that we're in, seeing scientists kind of realize that the way of understanding and exploring consciousness, like how we even come to see these kinds of insights, really requires a new type of exploration, a new type of, and you know, there's always going to be this effort, this struggle to kind of put the scientific knowledge and the scientific language into communication and into conversation with the spiritual language, which I think is brilliant and exciting. But when those two don't fit together nicely, that's almost where the richest kind of insights are found, you know, when they kind of butt up against each other. And rather than saying that like the spiritual understanding of consciousness or the spiritual understanding of the mind or the body is somehow mistaken or less advanced, finally now we're seeing a little bit more of a respect or a reverence. Federico Fagan, yes.
There it is. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Dave. He, you know, we're seeing kind of this almost like a newfound respect for the insights and the work and the understanding that has come from the spiritual life, in addition to scientific ways of doing. You know, so in my own personal life, I think that that's definitely been reflected. You know, I love science, I love math. I was always good at math. It was always very satisfying to me to have a correct answer that I could draw a box around. I love that. You know, and of course, you know, I got my PhD in religion and science. Like putting these into conversation was always really exciting. But when it comes down to it, I am also totally enchanted by energy healing. You know, there is something, whether it is, I was going to say almost whether it's merely, right? Merely, like whether it is really found in just this connection between two humans, or whether there's something more that we're not quite understanding about our own energetic bodies, you know, that question fascinates me. And honestly, I'm very happy with either answer, right? I'm fascinated by the way that people connect and the way that our consciousnesses, our nervous systems and our consciousnesses are regulated by people who are around us, you know, and by our relationships and things like that. So
Right.
yeah.
And we'll end with the last question. Another colleague and friend from Boston University, Khan.
Hi, thank you again for the fantastic talk. I'm very interested in this topic, and especially from the point of view that I'm interested in the relationship between our experience and our understanding of the world and our place in it, right? So talking about religion, I think there is a key concept that is sacred. And so we're talking about spiritual tech here. So I see a little bit tension here. I want to put it in a dichotomy. So in one way, we see that the spiritual tech bring us closer to the sacred, or is it bring the sacred to make it into something that is ordinary? So I wonder what your thoughts on that.
Interesting. Yeah. So whether we're sort of elevating our own sense and our own perceptions in order to perceive the sacred, or if we're sort of bringing the sacred down to us, I don't know. I don't know if it. Um, okay. So this is how I'll answer that. One of the approaches of kind of the um, understanding what equanimity and compassion and kind of understanding the the deepest form of self or no self. Sometimes the way that that's spoken about is that it's not so much that you're elevating or that you're trying to reach nirvana or achieve enlightenment or ecstasy or something like that. Actually, like the one way of conceptualizing this is actually you're just clearing away the muck, like the ego stuff that's actually getting in the way of you realizing that the nirvana or enlightenment or the spiritual essence, that nugget, is actually what's the deepest thing. It's the thing that's already there. It's just kind of clouded over by these by the stuff of life, right? And so in that sense, I think that both actually the neurofeedback kind of approach and maybe even the brain stimulation approach, what they're, if it's hard to, it's really hard. Like I mentioned, it's hard to kind of translate the the brain science, the activity, sort of the mechanism of either of these interventions into kind of these philosophical concepts. But there is a way in which, like, neurofeedback is kind of teaching your brain to kind of settle some of the brain waves that might be distracting you from this more pure nugget that's within. And similarly with the brain stimulation, again, the mechanism is not always clear, but there is a way in which you could conceptualize, and many of the, Jay and Shinzen and these folks that I've been talking about, they do actually conceptualize this as sort of a stimulation that's not actually stimulating to create more brain activity. It's actually stimulating to quiet brain activity. And so in that sense, it's not so much bringing the spiritual down to the mundane world, but understanding that, like, the spiritual truth, the nugget that is being sought, is the deepest thing already, So that's kind of how I would approach that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Khan. And
So,
I'd hate to not let people ask questions. So Eileen, I see that you have a question. If you could keep it very short, because we're way over time, but yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
So I want to talk briefly about the charlatans and the snake oil salesmen. Because, in the psychedelic world, there's no one helping that not be exploitative. And I've known women who've gone on some of the tourism and not good.
right.
Are any of these companies that you talk about who are building some of the technology trying to build in anything that will prevent the use by charlatans and snake oil salesmen? Are they thinking about it? Is it even in their consciousness?
Yeah, it is. I don't know if I don't know if I've heard anybody phrase it like what you're saying, to prevent charlatans and snake oil salesmen from buying and using their products, kind of thing. But I will say that there has been a lot of thought, and especially, again, I'll talk about Mikey Siegel. One of the things that he's really interested in is talking very explicitly and very intentionally and carefully about the production process for these. So the idea that, like, these cannot be motivated by product, or means, I'm sorry, by profit and by, like, the company's bottom line and these kinds of things. Like in order to build and sell a spiritual product, it's got to be made in a spiritual way, he would say. And so he talks about, like, there's a group called the what is it called? I'll think of it and put it in the chat. But it's basically a setting where folks go and they meditate for half the day. They've got high-speed internet. They're working on projects, and you kind of apply and you go and you stay at this. It's almost like an ashram. But the idea is that you, from this place of spending half of your day meditating, from this place is where you work to create the technologies that will actually help heal folks and stuff like that. So there is a lot of really intentional work being done in from that place, in terms of making sure and kind of keeping in check their own processes of production, and marketing and things like that. And like I mentioned, Jay and Shinzen are doing this in Monastic Academy. Yeah. And the Soryu for All, SORYUFORALL, is one of the people who directs this academy, the Monastic Academy, where this kind of work is done. They've got the materials, the resources, the high-speed internet to do this cutting edge, contemporary work, but also pairing it with contemplation and compassion training and things like that. So otherwise, I think probably the way to watch out for snake oil salesmen and charlatans is going to have to be education and talking about it, and as soon as, for example, in the ayahuasca tourism industry, as soon as you hear or have an experience of someone who is abusing women or abusing people, abusing the whole system, then that person just, there has to be like a conversation, checks and balances and awareness within the folks who are going to pay money to go down and take ayahuasca from a shaman, conversations about how to choose someone who has been vetted and stuff, because exactly those kinds of things are just very, very difficult and very, very dangerous. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And finally, I'd like to thank you, Kate, again, Dr. Stockley, for an amazing, amazing, fascinating lecture. I'm sure that everyone really appreciated this. Join me in a round of applause for Kate Stockley. Thank you so much. And the first link, one of the first links that I put in the chat box here is a link to Kate's and Wesley's book. I went through half of it just before, just in the past week. Really amazing, amazing information there. So follow that link if you wanna access to the book. Thanks again, Kate. Thanks everyone for showing up, and we'll keep you updated as to our future lectures. Take care, everyone. Good evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.